Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Victoria Barnett, who has recently written an article for the magazine and our website called "There's No Such Thing as a Bonhoeffer Moment." So we are going to be diving into that article and learning a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Before we do that, Victoria, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I was one of the general editors of the 17-volume Bonhoeffer Works English edition. So I've read every word the man wrote in German and English. I also, for a number of years, was the director of the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Museum. My area of expertise is much broader than Bonhoeffer. I've looked a lot at the history of the churches during National Socialism, and that's actually how I came to work on the Bonhoeffer Works.
Excellent. Thank you for the background. Um, In this article, you say that as a scholar of more than just Bonhoeffer, but as a Bonhoeffer scholar, you are constantly hearing the question, are we in a Bonhoeffer moment? I was fascinated to learn that you said you've heard this question from people all over the political spectrum, the theological spectrum. I'm curious what this question means to you when you hear it, and if it shows up or means maybe different things with some of these different groups of people you work with.
Sure. So one note, because began to see comments about this on social media after I published the article. So Stephen Haynes, who's written a lot about Bonhoeffer reception history, traces it among American evangelicals back to 2012 or so. That's when he first began to see it in publications. But I have been giving Bonhoeffer talks since the 1990s. And I can remember very early on getting a variation of that question. Now, as I think back, maybe it wasn't, are we having a Bonhoeffer moment? But what people often asked me was, what would Bonhoeffer say today? What would Bonhoeffer do today? And for me, it's a way of signaling that people see him as this seminal figure who bore witness to something extraordinary under National Socialism. And when we look around the world today, and that's not just today, but in the 1990s, whenever you want to think of it, there are also always burning issues where people think, the church should be doing something. And that's when the question pops up, what would Bonhoeffer say today? And it comes up among liberal Protestants. I've heard it from, evangelical Christians. I've heard it from, people who are not even that religious, but they know about Bonhoeffer. So I think it's pretty widespread.
Yeah, that's interesting. But a big part of the essay is trying to distinguish between Bonhoeffer as he really was, the real human being, and the myths and legends and stories that have been woven about him. I'm familiar with some of the more recent projects about Bonhoeffer, books, movies, but I didn't know. You said that this hagiography about him started just like immediately after World War II ended. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how and why this early kind of storytelling about Bonhoeffer occurred.
Yeah, I suspect that both in post-war Germany and in the English-speaking world, after the end of National Socialism and this horrific war and the Holocaust, there was a search for heroes. Who did the right thing? Who was the person? And one of the fascinating things about Bonhoeffer is that he begins to be described both as a martyr and a resistance figure. And the first publication about that is Reinhold Niebuhr's article in June of 1945. So just 2 months after Bonhoeffer has been executed, in a magazine called Christianity in Crisis, that was called The Death of a Martyr. And it got widespread attention. This was Reinhold Niebuhr. The next month, George Bell, who was a prominent bishop in Great Britain, preached a sermon in honor and memory of Bonhoeffer and called him a martyr and noted his resistance. That was broadcast over the BBC. There are publications that begin to be issued during 1945, including a little book by the World Council of Churches that is distributed in December 1945, called Witness of a Messenger, Zeugnis eines Boten. So it shows that immediately after the end of the war, and even in Niebuhr's essay appears before everyone in the Bonhoeffer family knew that he had been killed. I mean, it's very striking to see how soon the news comes out and how quickly Christians kind of seize onto it that, this was the person who stood up to Hitler. And I think out of that comes a lot of the mythology because the seed is planted so early.
Wow, hard to imagine learning about a family member's death reading a Reinhold Niebuhr essay in a
Well,
magazine.
I don't think they learned about it from that, but Niebuhr's essay came out because the communication in post-war Germany was so bad
Hmm.
that the family in Berlin was still trying to find out what had happened to people.
Wow. Interesting history, not to go on too much of
Yeah.
a rabbit trail, but Niebuhr's magazine, Christianity in Crisis, I think he started because he had been writing regularly for the Christian Century and then had kind of a clash with the editor. And so he decided to go do his own magazine, somewhat in protest, I think.
I can't remember if he was the person, but I do know some of the history of the Christianity in Crisis because I used to write for them. And they actually did emerge, I think, in 1939 or 1940. There was a strong isolationist movement in American Protestantism, and the Christian Century, was on one side, and the Christianity in Crisis emerged as the people who were arguing for some kind of engagement or in U.S. American involvement in the Second World War.
Yeah, I think the history of the Christian century, which Alicia Kaufman has an interesting book about it.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, there was a pacifistic commitment in the history of the
yeah.
editorial team that did kind of lead to an isolationist position on World War II, which is not a thing we look back on happily, as the magazine now. But
Well, this is before Pearl Harbor, which is when America got involved in it. And there were strong voices, people who remembered the First World War and said, we need to stay out of this one. So there was a real divide in American Protestantism. But that's the backstory of Christianity in Crisis.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to really think about in your article today is at the end of the essay, you're telling us, if we have a real, more accurate picture of who Bonhoeffer really was, there's a lot we can learn. This is a decent, kind person trying to live faithfully in the midst of an evil time. And you shared a really powerful quote from one of his letters about viewing the events of world history from
Yeah.
below, from the perspective of oppressed and suffering people. I wonder if other aspects of his work and writing come to mind for you, other thoughts or passages that you would recommend to people who are looking to maybe learn from him without this heroic interpretive lens being kind of placed over his
Yeah.
work.
I think that, I mean, so the quote you mentioned is from a little essay called After 10 Years, which was a letter that he wrote to members of his family and one of the resistance figures in December of 1942. It's part of Letters and Papers from Prison. And I think that that book I mean, it's just an extraordinary book because this is him toward the end of his life reflecting on what has happened. But the other book I like to recommend to people is Life Together, which he wrote in the mid 1930s. He wrote it for his seminarians at Finkenwalde. He was teaching seminarians in the Confessing Church for several years before the Gestapo closed those seminaries down. And he's in that book, he's trying to instill a sense in them of what they need to know if they're going to be Christian pastors in a system like Nazi Germany. And keep in mind, the mid 1930s, for all Bonhoeffer knew, this was the future of Germany for centuries to come. He didn't know what was going to happen. And so he's training these idealistic young seminarians who want to serve the confessing church. They don't want to serve the Nazified church. That's why they ended up in the confessing church. And he's suggesting to them that they need a regular, routine, daily routine of prayer, devotion, confession, relaxation, doing hobbies that sort of give them a personal release under the pressures of National Socialism, and community. And the community aspect was the one that he really emphasized there because I think he understood that dissidents in Nazi Germany, that's what these young men were, dissidents needed a community. You can't get through a time like this as a lone ranger. And when you know that background, it's a tremendously moving book. And I also think it's a moving glimpse of Bonhoeffer because I think up to that point, he was anti-Nazi from the beginning, but he didn't know what to do. He's a single person, so trying to put together what resistance looks like, how you withstand the pressures of a regime like that, and keep in mind throughout the 1930s, the dominoes are falling. Germans conform pretty quickly, and so by the mid 1930s, when he's teaching his seminarians, German society is pretty Nazified, and you have to be very careful of who you talk to. And I think that's one of the reasons that he takes these young seminarians, out in the middle of nowhere, and says, "So if you're going to be a minister, if you're going to be a pastor of the Christian church in this situation, here's what you need to do for yourself." And when you understand that, it's tremendously moving, I think. So
Thank
those are
you.
the books I would recommend.
Yeah, thanks for those recommendations. Well, I'm sure there's so much more we could say, but you've given us a lot to think about. Anyone out there, we're going to have a lot of links in the video description below. If you missed Victoria's article in the Century, we'll have a link to that, along with a link to her most recent book, After 10 Years, a recent book review that she's written. Maybe we'll even throw some links to some of these Bonhoeffer books that we just learned about. Thank you so much for chatting today, Victoria, and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.